Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen, and I'm broadcasting this from Soho in London. Recently, I was asked to write a piece about Soho for Boundless magazine. And the feature of the piece was the fact that in Soho, things ain't what they used to be. There are two Sohos. There's the dense grid of streets west of Charing Cross Road, north of Shaftesbury Avenue and east of Regent Street. But there's Soho, in inverted commas, which haunts us. It's always been lost, or at least disappearing, is better than it is now, made up of stories, myths and memories, a place populated by the ghosts of characters who were more interesting, more artistic and bohemian, somehow more authentic than we are. And that's not to say that the actual real place itself isn't extraordinary. I mean, every one of these 200 plus roads, courts and alleys that make up this Soho grid has a history, practically every building a fable. Collectively, they have this genuinely astounding cultural, countercultural depth. Thinkers, artists, musicians, scientists, inventors, writers and freaks have lived and worked here. William Blake, Karl Marx, Mozart, John Logie Baird, Casanova, the engineer Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the artist Nina Hamner or Augustus John, the pioneering nurse Mary Seacole, the singer and muse Betty May were just a few. One of the people who lived and worked here, who has become rather forgotten, is the subject of this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. And in his case, things ain't what they used to be is particularly appropriate because it's Frank Norman, scar-faced ex-jailbird Frank Norman, 1930 to 1980, who was part of the 50s and 60s Soho bohemian set, friends with Francis Bacon, Lucien Freud and the Colony Room clique. After an appalling childhood life as a criminal and time inside, Frank became a successful novelist, writer of the hit cockney musical Fings, Aint What They Used to Be, and an acclaimed prison memoir, Bang to Rights. But long before that, before he became a literary sensation, he found an unexpected outlet whilst he was in prison, painting. He got so absorbed in painting, said, at times I wasn't in the nick at all. But after his time in prison, and despite obviously being a talented artist, he never painted again. The reason I'm telling you that is because if you're listening to this in early 2025 and can be in London in the next couple of months, we've curated an exhibition here in Soho at the Century Club, Frank Norman's paintings that were created whilst he was inside in the 50s and 60s, and it's the first time they've ever been publicly shown. Details for that in the show notes, but don't worry if you're listening to this some other time or you can't be there, because this episode will tell Frank's extraordinary story by somebody who knows it best. But before that, I'd just like to welcome you if you have been to the Bureau before, welcome you back if you have, and say hello and thanks to these countercultural folk who've written to me with their thoughts and suggestions. Ronnie, as ever, James, Edward, Annette, Chris, Heather, Aziz, Elisa, Pat, Joe and Mark. Always good to hear from friends. You can join us too, bureauoflostculture.com. But back to today, because I'm joined by Joe Daniel, Frank Norman's grandson, to take a deep dive into Frank's extraordinary life and the life of Soho in the late 50s and 60s. Joe recently republished Frank's classic book, Soho Night and Day, a wonderfully evocative snapshot memoir of the area in the 60s. We're going to get into all that. We're going to talk about Soho, we're going to talk about alcohol, we're going to talk about music, and of course, counterculture. Welcome, Joe Daniel. Joe.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
And we're going to talk about your forebear, but tell us who you are and about Joe Daniel.
I grew up in Cambridge, which is actually where my grandmother went a few years after she broke up with Frank, with my mum, to bring her up, as she put it, kind of away from all the kind of goings on in Soho. First moved away in 1960 when my mum was born, and they lived in Scotland for a few years on the Isle of Islay, and then moved to Cambridge. My mum grew up there and stayed there and is still there, and I did the same. Moved to London when I was about 20, and I've always worked in music. I started a record label. I've worked in, and then I sort of segued from the label into the indie label market. It's essentially a farmer's market for record labels. It's independent labels coming together to sell records mainly and other merchandise and on a market stall. We do one big event in London every year at XL and Domino and Warp and Ninja Tune type labels, down to
Trunk Records.
Down to Trunk Records, exactly. They've been there. There's music and live performance. Actually started on Berwick Street. Berwick Street being the kind of sort of spiritual home of record shops and music in, or London maybe, would be a good place to do it. So for one day only, we sort of rocked up and took over the market. And I think there was a handful of stalls selling fruit and veg and fish and stuff, and we were in amongst it. The idea was that it would be all the founders of the record label would come down and kind of get their hands dirty, flogging the records, with a money pouch on and fingerless gloves, and
like he was flogging a bunch of bananas or something.
And some good banter to sort of pull people in and offer some deals, and that was the concept. I think it'd be fun for record label guys to do this. Usually you're sort of stuck in an office and you get your feedback from distribution figures and YouTube comments and things like that, all on a screen really. Whereas actually when independent labels start, it's normally one or two people who are extremely passionate about some music or other, and they're often the ones at the gigs with the box of CDs, vinyl or whatever it is, flogging it.
But you've gone from strength to strength though.
Well, it was meant to be just a one-off fun day, and then we did one in New York that was meant to be a one-off fun day, and then it kind of grew and we went international for quite a while. We did Paris, Barcelona, Berlin and Rome and all sorts of others. We even did one in Tokyo, really until the pandemic, and it's since then we've been really just doing one massive event in London. It's
interesting, isn't it? Because we live in a time when record store culture is just like, didn't it? It survived, and not only has it survived, but it's thrived, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
Rough Trade opening another store in central London,
Yeah. That's
I mean,
impressive.
I remember it was just Rough Trade West, the little shop over on Talbot Road, and I remember when they were opening Rough Trade East in Brick Lane, I was thinking, really? That's brave. And it's just
100%,
kicked off, isn't it? It's so good.
It's nice, and it seems to move down the generations, and whether you've got a little portable Crossley record deck or some souped up mega sound system, there's lots of ways to enjoy it, and it's kind of, it's something about the collecting and the kind of tactileness of it, and it just endures. So it's nice to do this event which celebrates it, and where lots of people come together who all have that same feeling about vinyl culture and music in general.
Well, you hit on it there. It's a culture. My friend Travis Elborough famously wrote about 15 years ago his book, The Long Play Goodbye. It was a kind of hymn to the vinyl record, which we all thought was going to disappear.
Right.
And just as he published it, a Rough Trade opened their shop in East London, and it's no longer a lost culture.
Right.
But nearly got lost. So, Joe, that's your daytime life. Soho Night and Day, Berwick Street, and let's talk about that. When did you realise who your grandfather, Frank Norman, was, or that he had led this extraordinary life?
Well, I read some of his books when I was quite young, early teens. I knew that he'd written a musical that was famous, Fings, Aint What They Used to Be, which ran in the West End for a couple of years and toured around the world and made him a lot of money for a short time. He sort of became wealthy. But he said, the only period of affluence that I've ever experienced. My play, Fings Ain't What They Used to Be, was playing to packed houses at the Garrick Theatre, and royalties came pouring in. Life became a gigantic booze-up. I acquired a bright red sports car and an insatiable appetite for beluga caviar and Piper Heidsieck champagne. People whispered that I had been ruined by success, but were unaware how ruined I had already become through failure. The unaccustomed wealth was like being handed a loaded pistol with a hair trigger.
That's a great point, isn't it? I'd rather be ruined by success than ruined by failure.
So yeah, I kind of knew about that, and then I read Banana Boy, which had quite a big impact on me. It's a very poignant and powerful book. All kids, certainly in my generation, all grew up reading Roald Dahl, and I read his two autobiographical books, Boy and Going Solo. And as a counterpoint to those, it's really quite stark,
Similar ages, I guess, Roald Dahl and Frank.
Yeah, not terribly far apart. I think Roald Dahl might have been a little bit older, but he went to a private school. He had a relatively privileged background. He didn't have all that hardship.
Yeah.
Even though actually a private school and a boys' home probably in lots of ways weren't that dissimilar. Maybe the education was better and you weren't just written off. Punishments maybe were pretty harsh as well.
Away from your parents, yeah.
And away from your parents, exactly. He's given up for an adoption when he was 3, sort of illegitimate, which is a word that doesn't sound like it works these days,
There's so many astonishing things about Frank's story. He's born in Bristol in 1930, as you said, the illegitimate son of Frank Charles Booth and Beatrice Smith née Norman. As you said, we don't really use that word illegitimate anymore. Basically it means born out of wedlock, as they used to say, right? Abandoned by his parents, there's some unsuccessful adoption attempts, ended up in a succession of children's homes in and around London. One of them, Dr. Barnardo's the most famous, I suppose, out in Stepney.
He didn't know that much about his own life, and he'd kind of filled in the gaps himself, kind of, just made stuff up, which then he'd repeated to himself and to other people so many times that it obviously just became his own truth.
He made stuff up about the gaps in his memory, and as we do, sort of in the telling and retelling of the stories, the story kind of grows into being history. Because
he had no history of his own. He didn't know until later on, when he was, I think in 1966, he got information from Dr. Barnardo's, as much as information as they had about his early life, which was really just names and dates. But when he started consciously thinking about where he'd come from, he didn't know when his birthday was, he didn't know who his parents were, he didn't know where he was born, anything about his family life. And so he had this idea in his head that he was from London, his father was from the East End. Turned out not to be true at all. He was born in Bristol.
I wonder what that's like psychologically, to be so unmoored. We've all got a sense, haven't we, of continuity and identity, with early childhood memories. You grew up with it, and it's part of your kind of anchor, isn't it, in some sense? How strange it must have been to just not know that stuff.
I mean, you can read in Banana Boy, which I think is my favourite book of his, he latched on to teachers, and there was solidarity with the other children as well, to some degree. They sort of became his closest what he could have to a family. And there was a couple of teachers that he did like, but most, by and large, they were pretty unkind to him. And he said he didn't hear his Christian name until he'd left school at 16. So
because he was always called Norman, which is a kind of Christian name, weirdly.
That's true, exactly.
The school I went to, for very different reasons, was like that. You were sort of always referred to by your second name.
Yeah.
It was some sort of hangover from the Empire or something. After a little bit of working, petty crimes, and he goes to prison, right? For most of us, you'd think, well, I know what's going to happen next. No. This story doesn't go there, right? This is a story of somebody who, despite that, in spite of that, possibly even because of that, became a phenomenon in a very successful, for a time, writer, right? Wrote many novels, plays, a hit musical, all sorts of journalistic pieces, and a very accomplished painter. Became a figure in this little world where, we're sitting now in Soho. Famous, notorious a little bit. During his times, was rubbing shoulders with some very famous people. Well, he's much more forgotten now than they are, possibly. But how the hell did he turn such an appalling start in life into a success?
It's interesting, isn't it? He would have, I guess, gained a huge amount of resilience, sort of trauma, really, that he must have had to deal with or suppress or build up a kind of armoury around himself in order to kind of move forward in his life. He was never very good at relationships, including with my grandmother and mothers of his other children, which is all detailed in his books to some degree or another. But he muddled through with a kind of humour that seemed to be the thing that kind of got him beyond himself. So he didn't dwell on what had happened to him. It wasn't bitter or angry, even though I'm sure that came out now and again. He probably masked some of his feelings with drinking, and he certainly had a problem there, but was able to sort of turn it into something positive, which I think that is a thing where someone who's experienced the worst of life can then turn it into something useful for them, and also use it as a vehicle to get their way out of it. The humour of the way he saw the world and didn't take everything too seriously, so would have made him a lot of fun, I think, and was why he was popular, had lots of friends, and was someone that people liked having around at the places like the Colony Room.
All the things which you said, I get, but it still doesn't somehow explain it.
No, you're right.
There are other people. Bruce Oldfield, is a classic one. He also was at Barnardo's. Became a huge fashion star, designer, incredibly successful, right? And it's not like that everybody who has a bad start in life turns out bad, and that everybody has a great start in life turns out. We know that's not true. That's part of the mystery of life in a way, isn't it? People have these incredibly comfortable, wonderful, supported backgrounds and go to the dogs, as it were. But I couldn't get to it in Frank's case, how he managed to do this twist. All the things, all the resilience that he built up by, having to survive through, moving around homes and not knowing who his parents were, became a criminal, gets sent to prison. And it's in prison that he sort of turns to art. And that's astounding. It's an astoundingly positive thing.
Well, first of all, it was an option, art classes, and he did manage to get better in terms of reading. He was almost illiterate, I think, when he went to prison. But he read some books in prison and started painting. But one of the things he liked was that if you did a still life, you could eat the still life afterwards. So you could, an apple and a banana, then that could be your
That's great.
A lunch, which you might not get on the wing.
Let's have a listen to Frank himself here in conversation with the American interviewer par excellence, Studs Terkel.
But I've been in London since I was a child, and I'm illegitimate and all that, and I have a putative father who I've not met. And so I was put in an institution called Dr. Nada's Homes, and I stayed there till I was about 15. And I came to Soho. Right. Soho, contrary to popular opinion, is not a very violent place, in the sense that any battles that go on, which are very few these days, are only between one lot of villains and another lot of villains. They're really only after your money in the strip clubs, and they don't want to beat you up. I just hung around Soho, and I got mixed up with various people, and of getting involved with bad company. See. And I wound up in prison a couple of times. The English prisons are terribly overcrowded, and they're overcrowded mainly with just illiterates and poor people, right? I mean, I couldn't read and write when I was 14. In 1956 I came out, so altogether I did 5 years. But during that time, the last time I was there, I took up painting, see, and I got quite proficient, and I thought I might do painting. By the way, I couldn't sell any of my pictures until I became a writer, and then I sold all of them. And I think it was that which led me to writing Bank's Rights, which was about that 3-year sentence. It wasn't so much as that I gave up crime, not that I ever considered myself a criminal. It was that I changed my life and my horizons became sort of bigger, and maybe that led to writing. But I don't remember a precise moment that I thought I could write. And indeed, when I had written my first book, I didn't know that I was going to write a second one, right? And no, I think some success, had something to do with it. I mean, I think one gets heart from success. I mean, even if you get failure later on, if you get a big enough success, you can ride the failures easy. I mean, I would consider slightly dotty myself, and I once went to a psychiatrist. He said, "There's nothing wrong with you. Your only problem is how you're gonna manage to live like it." And through writing, I've found a freedom, you see. I mean, I don't have to be beholden to anybody. So I'm a thoroughly adjusted ex-con, right?
Somewhere in that 3 years in prison on the Isle of Wight, maybe that he met somebody, it may be that there was a mentor, there was some inspiring person there.
He knew Lucien Freud by that point, but when they first met, they lived together in a bombed-out squat, and Lucien painted Frank a couple of times, and he sat for him. There's lots of Lucien Freud biographies, but there's not lots of detail about that particular period, which would have been late 40s, early 50s. So Frank was, still a teenager. And I think he got back from his time travelling on the fairground and then ended up in Soho, where he met some interesting people. And I think Lucien was one of them. Maybe Dylan Thomas was another. I think he would have been inspired by them. That's all I can imagine, is that when 3 or 4 years later he was in prison, he thought, well, Lucien can paint.
Dylan can write.
And Dylan can write, exactly. So why don't I have a go at that?
Love that. That speaks somewhat maybe to this area too at that time, that, you might come, as many of us have, to London, to come to Soho, and found ourselves, depending on who you're hanging out with.
Exactly, yeah. When you see people that you've hung out with, especially if you've lived with them in a squat, sharing sandwiches and things, it doesn't seem that untouchable. It's not out of reach completely. You think, well, they did it, so I could, or I might as well have a go. And also, if you've got nothing, then there's nothing to lose. So I could imagine that prison give him the resolve not to go back.
Right.
So when he came out, he got a job as a van driver, and he spent about a year being fully dedicated to driving the van in the day and then coming back and writing at night. And by the end of it, he had banged to rights after about 8 months.
Which is his memoir of his prison life.
Which is the first thing he wrote, yeah. He was showing the manuscript to a friend whose girlfriend was the cleaner at the offices of Encounter magazine. And she said, why don't I take it and just leave it on the editor's desk? And, with your address on it. And so she did that, and then he got a call.
God, those are the days. That's every writer's dream, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Don't have to have an agent or anything. But if you walk on someone's desk, they read it and think, this guy's a genius.
There was far less people trying to do stuff like that. You could have a chance at doing that sort of thing. Now...
Yeah, you'd have to have an agent and a massive social media following before they'd even consider reading your manuscript.
Exactly. Right? They'd be checking your numbers, wouldn't they? The world that he was occupying in the 60s is that it was quite small, 200 other people who are into that sort of thing, rather than it being... just one of many, 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 many different countercultural things going on.
Frank, knowing Lucien Freud, knowing Dylan Thomas even before he went to prison, being this kind of milieu, this context of creative people, some of whom who made it, some of whom who didn't make it. It wasn't that everybody became a success. I get the impression that in the 80s, a similar thing went on with the New Romantics. A small group of people go into the Blitz Club. All know each other. Loads of them become super famous. Boy George, Spandau Ballet, Steve Strange.
And then Bowie came and got them as being a video.
Yeah. But it just happened to be a small location, a group of creative people from different class backgrounds who were just experimenting and sort of trying things out. Youth culture. But same thing happened in New York in the 70s, didn't it? Blondie and the Blank Generation people. Mm-hmm. I'm sure listeners around the world, you've got their own stories about this, and in the non-English speaking countries too, Paris in the 30s. It's just that he happened to coincide with that at the right time. Yeah. And for some reason... it sparked something in him. Not only the creative spark, but actually it's the work ethic.
Yeah, he put the time in and carried on doing that. There was a few gaps, particularly after he got really successful of the hair trigger of wealth. There was a couple of years sort of being a bit more relaxed, I think. But, in the first 3 years, he had 3 books, wrote a film and a play within 3 years of him leaving prison.
He found his thing, and he had the self-discipline and the energy, right, to drive the van during the day, go home and write in the evenings. And I'm imagining also be hanging out with his buddies in Soho and drinking a lot.
Sort of mid to late 40s until the mid 50s was when he was kind of involved in the underworld in Soho, working in a spieler, an illegal gambling den. He got a huge scar down his face from being attacked by racketeers who were trying to extort his boss, which, and he carried that scar with him for his whole life.
Was he tough?
Yeah, I think so. Reluctantly so. I think he got hardened up in the boys' home. I think he kind of shied away from violence in prison, but he was able to sort of tough his way through situations, and certainly he got in fights and things, but I think he actually was a bit of a pussycat, and he didn't relish those experiences, but he would sort of stand up to people.
He was working class. Well, sort of. It's difficult to tell, isn't it, when your parents have abandoned you. Very good, yeah, underclass. And this was also a time when, you get these writers from the north coming down to London, don't you? The Colin Wilsons, John Brain, these...
Angry young men.
Angry young men, right. Was he part of that set?
I think so. He knew Colin McInnes and hung out with him. There was an interest in the late 50s of hearing those kind of stories, which then went on to, the guy who wrote Kes, Barry Hines, those kinds of voices, which... you don't get as much these days, the sort of Ken Loaches and that. And also you've got Sheila Delaney, who did A Taste of Honey, and they were close. They both had plays produced by Joan Littlewood. Joan Littlewood wanted to work with Frank because he was a working class or underclass voice, for the same reason that she worked with Sheila Delaney. And that was what Joan was all about, was doing theatre in a different way, in a more working class way. All of the roles were played by working class actors. Barbara Windsor was her first role, was in Frank's play.
Late 50s, early 60s, there has been this eruption of underclass, working class creatives into what had previously been a kind of closed shop of middle class and upper middle class authors and artists, etc. He's part of that. I mean, I'm sure they didn't go around calling each other the angry young men. That's sort of the journalistic thing, isn't it? But stuck on people afterwards. But because I was trying to think, well, what would I call Frank? And I was thinking, well, he wasn't a beatnik, he wasn't a bohemian, he wasn't a bon viveur, and he wasn't a kind of flaneur. There's all these things which are associated with Soho, but he didn't seem to be any of them in particular.
No, that's true. Perhaps elements of each of them in some way. He became quite bon viveur, with his taste for caviar and champagne. and a red sports car.
Just to skip back to his actual biography, he's come from prison, he's written his memoir, Bang to Rights. He is championed by Sir Stephen Spender, part of that older establishment, the literary elite in some way, right? And then by Raymond Chandler.
It was the last thing that Chandler did. He died 3 or 4 months after the book was released, had his foreword, and it was the only time he'd done an introduction like that for any other writer. And they met a couple of times, and then he died. Chandler obviously took a real shine to him, and it was his support that got the book published. And Secker and Warburg snapped it up and signed him for 2 or 3 books, I think.
Chandler himself at this time was a very successful, realist, kind of gritty, urban noir writer. So you can see why there'd be a connection there, right?
It must have been incredible for Frank that someone like that noticed and then was so forthright in the way that they wanted to champion them. The time frame of all of this early stuff was so quick. He went from being in prison to literally a year later having Chandler on the phone. And then a year after that, he had like a film in production. A year after that, he was rich. He said, so this is at the premiere of Fings Aint What They Used to Be in the West End. So it had already had the Joan Littlewood production at Stratford East. He's watching the play and he says, I found myself almost weeping over a rather elegant lady sitting in the seat in front of me. Only 3 short years before, I'd been sitting in the nick, wondering what I was going to do to get out. And when I did get out, what I was going to do. And here I was sitting in the stalls, wearing a very smart evening suit at the West End opening of my own play. It was all a pretty unbelievable story.
It is a remarkable story. It's a sort of story of incredible redemption, isn't it? You've gone to the dogs, but the dogs didn't quite get you. And now you're actually kind of owner of the dogs. In terms of Things Ain't What They Used to Be, it's had various revivals over the years, and it's this kind of cockney musical, right? In a strange way, Frank wanted to see himself as a sort of cockney sparrow, didn't he? He's really an East End lad, from the heart of cockneydom. And so Things Ain't What They Used to Be is almost like a kind of fantasy by somebody who wanted to be of that world.
Yeah, he was writing about what he'd observed, I think. He certainly spoke initially in a very sort of cockney styling. It wasn't really affected, but then he did sort of drop it later on. He adapted to his new situation as part of what he called the smart set. I think he was encouraged to continue in that vein. It was like you've written about prison, you've written about what got you there and the kind of adventures and stories, and he was sort of nudged in that direction a little bit by the publishers. Yeah. It became a little bit more cartoonish in the form of a Cockney musical, which he didn't really like. He never felt quite comfortable with that, and he wanted to do slightly more serious work, which he did then do with the follow-up, Cafe Up West. And so it was Lionel Bart and Joan Littlewood who I think kind of hammed it up and camped it up,
Here's a sidebar about Things Ain't What They Used to Be. Things Ain't What They Used to Be was a West End 1960s musical comedy about Cockney low-life characters in the 50s, including spivs, prostitutes, teddy boys and corrupt policemen. Fred Cochran, the hero, is a down-to-heel gangster trying to make a comeback. Lil Smith is his loyal mole, a tart with a heart of gold, who longs for respectability and keeps a marriage licence ready for her lucky day. Fred's Spieler, the gambling den, provides a refuge for the failures of the underworld. Paddy the gambler, Tosha the ponce with his girls Betty and Rosie, and Red Hot, a sad little burglar who never manages to get warm. They all look to Fred for a living. When he wins on the horses, it seems the gang may be back in business. Fred redecorates his place, all contemporary, and at the opening the horrible Percy Fortescue comes to gamble, and a rival leader, Meatface, is beaten in a razor fight. The play ends with a wedding. Lil and Fred are giving up crime to go straight, handing over the Spieler to the constable on the beat, whose log wanted to go crooked. Oh. He intends it to be a sort of straight work. John Littlewood, who I've got to do an episode about because an absolutely extraordinary titanic force, who championed the working class in it, with the theatre in Stratford. She reads it, she sees something else in it and brings them together with Lionel Bart. Now, of course, Lionel Bart, another fascinating character, a genuine cockney, also working class, Jewish. And in some ways, their sort of lives a bit of a parallel, didn't it? Because Lionel Bart, through this and through Oliver, becomes massively successful, right?
Yeah, so it was Fings was the play before Oliver. Oliver was a film that Frank did, which is very forgotten, but it's called In the Nick, was starring Anthony Newley, directed by Ken Hughes and produced by Cubby Broccoli. And that team went on to do Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and of course, obviously, Broccoli did the Bond films, and there was a lot of talk about Stand On Me being a film, the follow-up to Bang to Rights, which was about the period of his life preceding prison. So it was his sort of adventures in Soho, and that was going to be a film. But then Broccoli got sidetracked by Dr. No.
That worked out rather well for him.
It worked out well for him, yeah, he did okay.
I think Lionel Bart as well, of course, through the success of his musical, ended up eating beluga caviar and driving the red sports car too, didn't living in Chelsea, but it crashed and burned, in a terrible way, actually. In this 3-year period, you go from sitting in a cell to sitting in this theatre, with people loving your work and the money's pouring in. How'd you keep your head?
Well, I'm not sure he did, really. He there's some story about him and Brendan Behan, the Irish poet, wandering around Soho throwing fivers in the air because they just didn't know what to do with all this money that they had. I think he spent a lot of time in the colony room, and that's Enter Jeff, really. That's
right.
His best friend and drinking companion for best part of 2 decades. He met around the early 60s. Frank was very successful. They both hang out at the colony a lot.
So for listeners who don't know what this means, so the colony rooms were this very small, quite scruffy club in Soho, up a flight of stairs, which for some reason became this home to these incredibly successful people. Francis Bacon, Lucien Freud, Frank, Geoffrey Barnard, Tom Baker, early Doctor Who for Doctor Who fans.
A very young Suggs, because his mum was always there.
With them would be the Soho riffraff, the alcoholics. The thing about the colony room was, certainly Muriel Belcher, who ran it, didn't distinguish between any of them, because you were an increasingly famous, increasingly wealthy artist like Francis Bacon, or whether you were a sort of, the local drunk sitting next to each other. She called them both cunty, didn't she?
Exactly.
And that's why they liked it.
Yeah, egalitarian place for well-known people who don't want to talk about their work. I think that's a nice thing in life, is not to go around talking about what you're doing, when you're in the pub, shooting the breeze with people rather than going on about yourself. Yeah, Muriel Belcher started it in 1948. She met Francis Bacon, I think, in the same week, and she said, why don't you start drinking here for free and just bring people that you meet and hang out with. So Francis, over the next few years, populated it with people that he was friends with. Frank started going there probably about 10 years later, by the sort of late 50s, and it was all in full swing. Notable people went right through until it finished in 2008.
Yeah, I actually went myself a few times before the end. Damien Hirst was hanging out there, Tracy Emin were hanging out there.
Yeah.
But that was it. You don't talk about work because you're not acted up. You know what I mean? Nobody's going to be kissing your ass in there. If they do, they're going to get kicked out. So that's why they all liked it, wasn't it? Because they could actually just go and be normal, or as normal as they got, which involved getting extremely drunk and sort of getting quite nasty at times.
Exactly, yeah.
There, Frank is hard drinking and smoking like the rest of them, and he meets this person called Geoffrey Bernard. So Joe, tell us about Geoffrey Bernard.
Jeff was one of 3 brothers, and they all ended up in Soho in some degree or another. His brother Bruce Bernard is a photographer who took a lot of photos of Lucien Freud. He was a professional, a real photographer. Jeff was kind of got a camera for the purpose of this book, and then I'm not sure whether he took many photos outside of this, or certainly this was his only published project. A writer and gambler and womanizer, and very much a fixture in Soho, and sort of almost embodies the spirit of it in a way, the way in which people like to think of Soho. Jeff is almost the sort of mascot of that.
sort of caricature in some sense, and of somebody who kind of mythologised his own life by writing about it.
Exactly.
He had a column in the Spectator.
And then there was a play that contributed a lot to the mythologising.
And the play Geoffrey Barnard is Unwell became a hit, certainly in the West End. I think it might even have transferred to Broadway at one point. It's about him. He's one of these characters like Quentin Crisp, who wasn't really talented at anything specific apart from being themselves. That was their job, and they managed to get away and get paid for it.
I think that's a very good way of characterising Jeff, because if you read his work, it feels like it's not really the sort of thing that many people could do these days. His Desert Island Discs is available online, and it's strange listening to it, because normally when someone's on Desert Island Discs, they feel very privileged to be on it and they're prepared, but he's almost quite sort of misanthropic, and he chooses great pieces, and he's very eloquent talking about his life, but it's a strange listen. He's so hard on himself, and maybe there's something in that kind of character that people are drawn to.
Let's have a listen.
So it was the early 50s in Soho, and Geoffrey Barnard, aged 20, newly discharged from the army, was trying to make a life for himself. Who were you mixing with? Who were your friends?
People like Ironfoot Jack, Handbag Johnny, who made a living stealing new handbags and selling them in the market. Sid the Swimmer, a bookmaker's runner, called himself Sid the Swimmer because he said he was always trying to keep his head above water. And then 5 minutes later, one would be having a drink with painters like Cahoon, McBride, Johnny Minton, Lucien Freud sometimes. I got to know Francis Bacon when I was pretty young. Louis MacNeice, Dylan Thomas, George Barker. Brendan Byrne, marvellous man when sober. Difficult otherwise, to put it mildly.
Jeff, booze, horses and women, is that the order of their importance in your life, or does it vary?
It varies from time to time. It started off women, horses, booze. Then, coming into the final furlong, booze moved up at an alarming rate. Women dropped back. Then I suppose that racing and booze crossed the line together, as it were, a dead heat.
Do you find, Geoffrey Barnard, that people come to you to talk about their drinking problems or habits? They kind of want to assuage their guilt by talking to someone who drinks rather more than they do?
They do sometimes, yes. The only way you can possibly give up drinking is to want to give it up. And I don't want to. And alcoholics are dreadful self-deceivers. Not many of them do really want to. I had 2.5 years on the wagon once because I did something awful and the remorse was ghastly. But it made me miserable, lonely, bad-tempered, melancholy. My then wife later cited these things in her divorce action against me.
How do you feel when, and we know they say these things to you because you write about them in your column, when they say to you, go on drinking and you've only got X months or 1 year to live?
I think to myself, go on talking. I've probably only got 10 more minutes to live.
To some people, it can bring a kind of lyricism, where the actual being an alcoholic itself has got a kind of seedy romantic glamour to it, and he embodied that in some way.
Absolutely right. It's sort of the fuel for that whole scene, really. Colony rooms, all the anecdotes, all the people, everything about it. I mean, it's a bar for one thing, because I think everyone in there had that romanticism and kind of driven by that particular strain of hedonism, drinking in the day. Members clubs where there's people drinking there in the day, if they have families and children, then there's a sort of stark choice being made there. You're not turning up for the kids in the playground, you're getting home late for dinner, you're arriving home drunk, and that unfortunately would have been everyone in the colony room. And also from my mum's stories, there's a romanticism there about Soho and the characters and the drinking and all of that. It's also, there's another side to it, which is like traumatised families.
When they weren't married or parents as well. It's somebody else is paying for it all. The other place in Soho, for listeners who are not familiar with this part of town, is There's a pub called the Coach and Horses, which Geoffrey Bernard propped up the bar in for many years. There was actual cartoons of him still there in the pub. He would always be there, sort of, raincoat hunched over the bar, and banned many, many times for being incredibly rude and boorish. And of course, the landlord, who became famous himself as the UK's rudest landlord, Norman Vallon. But the problem with being somebody like that, Geoffrey Bernard, is that everybody expects you to be Geoffrey Bernard. So everybody comes in and either buys you a drink or goad you into saying something horrible to them. Do you know what I mean? So that you kind of have to live up to this stereotype which you created yourself. But in terms of him and Frank meet, and actually they meet in the colony and they get on. The consequence of this friendship is this book, Soho Night and Day. And I just wanted to read this. For as long as anyone can remember, Soho has been the fluttering heart of London. Its storied pubs, shops, trattorias, gambling dens and nightclubs are every bit as alive as the millions of tourists, locals and crosstown visitors who crowd the streets all year round. People from all walks of life are made and unmade in Soho, and few knew it better than Frank Norman and Geoffrey Bernard. Writers and raconteurs, the pair haunted Soho's establishments for much of their lives. While Bernard was renowned for his low-life column in The Spectator, these pages collect his photos of the Soho he loved, with insightful commentary from Norman, an acclaimed novelist in his own right. Soho Night and Day is an authentic and very personal portrait of a special time and place. The tale of Soho in the 60s.
Frank, he'd done 3 memoirs at this point: Bang to Rights, Stand on Me, then The Gunts, which is his book about the kind of consequences of all the success he'd had with Fings. Then his publisher said, okay, what do you want to do next? He said, I'd like to do a book about Soho with my friend Jeff, that he's going to take the photos. So they were given their advance in 1962. The book took 4 years to materialise, which from letters that I've seen is mainly down to Jeff not producing the photos and them sort of having basically squandered the advance.
On booze.
Well, Jeff squandered his on 10 spins of the roulette wheel on the day that he got it in 1962. So they spent 3 or 4 years kind of trying to get it together. I think they did it in a few months. They went round Soho blagging meals and drinks basically, and then meeting us and interviewing people and hanging out. And Jeff did take some fantastic photos from a camera that Frank bought him. I think it was all wrapped up in sort of 65 and then came out the following year. Compared to Frank's earlier stuff, which all came together very quickly and was sort of part of this huge, very driven, prolific purple patch, this was a sort of more laboured project. The publishers getting cross with them and, them asking for more money. And so it was sort of a difficult birth. Given what a struggle it was, I think maybe the publishers just sort of wanted to get it out and move on. They certainly didn't want anything more to do with Jeff.
Jeff certainly took some brilliant photographs, whether or not he was professional with his drunk the time or not. It was a very, very important part of the actual fabric of this part of the city, the bohemian fabric of it, actually. This coffee culture which kind of grew up in the 50s. The Soho beatniks would be hanging out, poetry reading, skiffle. Early jazz and R&B scene was there, early hamburger bars.
There's a good little prophecy there about this is 50 years' time, there'll be
fast food joints everywhere.
Exactly,
right?
Several years before the first McDonald's.
And you've got the working class people down on the market, I guess, on Berwick Street, Broadwick Street. There's a guy here who's butchering a pig.
Tons of different places to buy food, and from all corners of Europe and all over the world, people would import stuff from their families in Greece and Italy and France. People would drive over to get authentic produce from somewhere in Europe and then drive it back and then sell it in Soho. Maltese, Turkish, Greeks, Italians, all
mixing up together, right? And
exactly.
There's a great shot of this elegant-looking, icy-looking sort of classic 60s woman here, eating an ice cream. And black people, which, of course, in this part of the country was getting more and more common. That you'd see much more of that, in London at the time, right? And then, of course, they don't shy away. The sort of sleaze, Soho bums, as this section is called. Mm-hmm. We look like some cool-looking teddy boys here, sort of rocking it up. Is it life drawing? A rather large naked lady. She's asleep by the looks of it. Of course, the musicians. There's a super cool black guy holding onto a sax there. And, of course, then the gangster set and the sort of the hoi polloi all together. No idea who these two people are, but they could either be a sort of mafia leader or a film star.
That's the landlord of the French pub.
Right.
Gaston Belmont.
Gaston. And you've got the Soho strip clubs, with the girls putting on each other's outfits for the evening and making each other up while smoking, of course, the prostitutes and all the signs, which you used to see all around Soho, didn't you? The walk-up signs, with Mademoiselle Helen, a French model, ring and walk up, and Joyce, flat 2, second floor, please ring and walk up. Monique. There's maybe one or two places in Soho where you might see a sign like that these days. Probably kept them put there by English Heritage or something, those days, just to remind of its past.
Blue plaque saying Monique was here.
The betting shops, the gambling shops, and there's some pretty tough, mean-looking types here, aren't there, playing poker. And terrifying Muriel from Colony. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of her, for sure. Soho Murder.
I think that was something that was quite topical at the time. It had happened the year before. It's all quite in the moment. It's
You also get the glimpses of these, like, what were obviously at the time new council flats being built, these kind of, in the early 60s, complete contrast to the rest of Soho, right?
Yeah, including the block on Berwick Street, which Jeff ended up living in. He ended his days there. That's where he was living after he had a leg amputated and in a high rise.
And for younger listeners, that's the one on the cover of the Oasis's Definitely Maybe album.
Yes.
It's a terrific visual survey, and of course Frank's text sort of gives it the narrative strength. And I think when it came out, what was the response to it?
Frank, he had a funny time in the mid-60s. He had all this early success, which tends not to go on, your kind of flavour of the month, and you have this early rush. It's very hard to maintain it. And I think he, quite early on, was concerned about that. This book came out and he then did a novel and then another novel, and I think they'd all been slightly diminishing returns by comparison to his first couple of books and the musical. I think it did well, but his publisher was they were trying to get another hit like Bang to Rights or Fings. And that did come later when he wrote Banana Boy, but I think that was at the end of the 60s. I think he was very sort of glad to get another bite at the apple at that point.
Certainly kept working, didn't he? He put out a lot of novels, non-fiction, plays, collaboration with Tom Keating, the art forger.
That's right.
Fakes Progress, brilliant.
And lots of journalism as well. He wrote for, he wrote for the Sunday Times and lots of publications. He also was a bit of a kind of staple on commentariat kind of shows. I think if there was a comment to be made about Bernardo's homes or prisons, and he also would go on things like Call My Bluff, as a panellist.
So he became a kind of personality. That's quite right too, in a way, because he'd actually had this extraordinary life. The money might have dwindled a bit. He'd had his high points, and which young person having that success at that time wouldn't go out and blow it on caviar and models and cars. But a real grafter all the way through the 70s, right? But died in 1980 and he was only 50.
Yeah.
Okay, given the lifestyle that these people were leading, a diet of alcohol and cigarettes, right?
Yeah, it was very sad.
early.
Developed Hodgkin's lymphoma, and from diagnosis to death was only a few weeks. So he sort of fell ill on a holiday in Spain in the summer. They abandoned their holiday, came back to see what was going on. Then he was in and out of hospital having tests, couldn't figure it out. And then by October or something, it was diagnosed as Hodgkin's. And then he had a couple of operations to try and save him or minimise the damage, and then he just deteriorated very quickly and died just before Christmas 1980.
Jeffrey Bernard sort of coughed and spluttered on for another kind of couple of decades, amazingly pickled till the end. But you told me about you mentioned the two Roberts, Robert Colquhoun and Robert McBride, these extraordinary story, these gay artists, who big openly gay at that time, and they also drank themselves to death.
Both died in sort of alcohol-related incidents. One wandered in front of a car. One was just about to have a show that was going to make him as an artist, apparently, and then someone burnt down his studio and all the paintings. I mean, they were fantastic painters, and as characters, they were also brilliant. There's a Ken Russell film on about them moving to Suffolk to set up a studio where they're going to paint, and that was sort of right in the midst of their prolific era in terms of painting, but they never really had any commercial success. But Frank knew them and was friends with them probably in the early 50s.
You mentioned it at the beginning, he started painting in prison, but he was a pretty accomplished painter, wasn't he, as well?
Yeah. I don't think he painted much after he got successful at writing, but certainly for a time he really, really did try and become a painter. He did a lot of painting in prison. Maybe there's about 50 or 60 paintings that we've got in the same portfolio folder that he brought with him when he left prison, and it's got his name and his prison number on it.
Part of your mission, I suppose, along with the republication of Soho Night and Day and all the research that you're doing into sort of Frank's stories and background and bits and pieces coming to light, you've sort of made Frank, your grandfather, your project?
I hoped that we can bring a bit more of his legacy kind of back to the world. I think Bang to Rights and Banana Boy certainly should be available again. He did a couple of things that were never published. One was a unstaged play that he wrote about Francis Bacon, set in the Colony Room, which he never did anything with because he was just worried about what Francis would think, basically. It's called Rough Trade, and it's about Francis and his interests. That would be great thing to do now. And then also he wrote a final memoir which would need a little bit of tidying up, but it's his account of being ill and dying from the point of view of both himself and his wife. He instructed her that they were both going to write their account of the whole thing. Afterwards she edited it into one chapter each, sort of, so they're both writing about the same thing at the same time from a different perspective. That's brilliant, very brutal. He also did an incredible photo shoot with him first wearing his best clothes, but he's very jaundiced and lost lots of weight, and they're kind of hanging off him. And then it ends up with him having these portraits where he's completely naked, just standing in front of the camera, smoking, about 2 weeks before he died. This is it. It's very full on, brutal, and I think at the time it got rejected on account of those things. People won't like this. But I think now, actually, the world's moved to a place where people would be quite interested in someone's account of their own death.
Totally, and also would sort of recognise that as an artistic intervention. He squeezed a lot into those 50 years, adding all the booze and the relationships.
And his own set of illegitimate children as well.
So how many kids has he got?
He had 3 kids. The first one was the most legitimate. My mum was sort of somewhere in between, and then the third one, no one actually knows whether he knew about that son. Some family member or cousin might correct me about that.
There's lots of grandchildren?
So there's 6 of us, yeah.
Are you in contact?
We all are more or less in contact, yeah. There was some that I didn't know anything about, and some that I vaguely knew of and hadn't met. But yeah, the internet kind of brought us all together, mainly about 15 years ago when I first met Geraldine properly and lived with her for a while in the flat that she shared with Frank. And she said, oh, well, have you not met Nick or someone else that you know? And she just sort of enlightened me to these cousins that I didn't know about. And then there was a couple more that sought us out.
So listen, why don't we finish, Joe, with you reading another bit of Frank's writings about his life.
This is from a chapter called Living, which is at the end of the Gunts, his account of becoming rich and successful. I find it impossible to imagine what it's all about. We're born, we meet a bird, we get married, have a pile of kids, and then die. Our kids then take up where we left off. Some people build monuments to themselves in the shape of cathedrals or bridges or even prisons. Others paint pictures or compose music. Some are murdered and others are hanged. Some die at birth, and others live to be 110. All of it will be dust in 5,000 years. All the monuments of the great and all of the gravestones of the not-so-great. Is it all for a reason, or is it all for no reason at all? Is it simply because we are living on a planet which just by chance happens to have the right elements for the survival of animal life?
Joe, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture and telling us about your extraordinary grandfather, Frank Norman.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to Joe for that. I'd never heard of Frank before I met Joe, and it's been fascinating to hear about this, somewhat forgotten life and to check out some of the work. I was really blown away, actually, still by the way that Frank somewhat mysteriously really turned his life around after such an inauspicious start. I mean, how difficult is it to do that? And not only to do it, but to do it in such a creative way and to produce so much work. And as I mentioned, we have the exhibition of Frank's paintings, which I've got to say, even with the amazing backstory, they're actually terrific. It's a bit like he compressed 50 years of art history into his time in prison and was a skilled artist. For whatever reason, decided not to carry on with that and concentrate on his writing. But if you see these works, and I'll post some of them in the show notes too, you will be surprised. Details there and about Soho Night and Day. Thanks very much for listening. Write to us, tell us about who, where you'd like to hear about, and we'll meet again further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides. for more tales from the counterculture. Let's finish, as usual, with some music. This is another track from the album Songs for Crow by the Clerkenwell Kid. See you.